All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Jeff Dancy. I'm in the political science department at Tulane. I teach human rights. Some of you already know that. Thank you for coming along. There's a sign-up sheet. Please send it around. Everybody sign up. I've got to prove to the provost that you came to this because they were very generous in supporting our talk today, who's Professor JStewart from the University of British Columbia. He's Associate Professor of Law there. The Tulane Provost has given us a faculty networking seminar grant to do this, which is funded by the D.W. Mitchell Fund, and it's very kind of them to do that work for us. And I would also like to thank Dean Meyer in the law school for co-hosting this event and giving us this very nice room. As you know, if we did this in the political science department at Norman Mayer, the rooms, come on, it just wouldn't be as nice. Instead, we have the double-barrel PowerPoint presentation in here. It's perfect. Originally from New Zealand, JStewart has spent the last 20 years working in international criminal justice as either a practitioner or a scholar. He's currently Associate Professor of Law at UBC, and prior to that, he was an appeals counsel at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He's also done stints at the Red Cross, or International Committee on the Red Cross, and also the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So extensive experience. What I like most about James's work is that it's close to practice. He is not just your regular ivory tower academic that's talking about abstract concepts, which is something that people often say about me. Thanks, you guys. He's been on the ground, and he knows what's at stake for the project of international criminal law in practice. This also makes his work impactful. When he does decide to write something, people read it and people talk about it. In 2006, he received the Lapira Prize for his work on unlawful confinement at Guantanamo Bay. And in 2010, he was awarded the Cassese Prize for his work on the liability of corporate actors for international crimes, which is something he'll be talking about today. His articles have been cited by these courts, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and the International Criminal Court. And he's published op-eds in a number of leading newspapers, including the New York Times and the Washington Post, one of which came out only about 2 weeks ago. I encourage you to read it. It's about whether President Trump is promoting illegal actions in Syria. Most importantly, James is thinking through the various ways that we at once resist corporate abuses and prevent atrocities in the world, which in my book are two of the most important issues of our time. So it's a treat that we get to hear his ideas today, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming JStewart.
Very much, Professor Dancy, for the generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I do have to start with something of a confession. You've been enticed here with something of a cheap slogan, which is blood diamonds. And it's only part of what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about the idea of pillaging natural resources generally. Now, pillage just means theft during war. It's a war crime, and it features in all aspects of international criminal law, both at an international level, so international courts and tribunals, but also in national criminal justice systems, including here in the United States. And I want to talk to you about the idea that potentially by prosecuting this, we get to address both the means and motivation for atrocities in different parts of the world. So let me say a little bit first about the cheap slogan. So this is a Hollywood movie about blood diamond. I'm not sure if you've seen it. It is, in a way, a grotesque conversion of a set of issues that should be depicted a little bit with the sobriety and solemnity of Schindler's List, and it's a conversion of that into an action flick, but nonetheless one that generated a great deal more public consciousness about the nature of the problem. The thing about diamonds is that they were an important aspect of the phenomenon I'm going to talk to you about, the illegal exploitation of natural resources to finance armed groups. But really they're the tip of the iceberg. A whole range of other natural resources serve the same purposes. Coltan, tin, timber, jade, the list goes on and on. So let me give you something of a roadmap of the sorts of things that I hope to discuss with you in the next 40 minutes or so. So I want to start by talking to you a little bit about the application of the war crime of pillage to natural resources and some of the initiatives that are being undertaken now in international criminal justice to promote the idea that this could be helpful in preventing atrocities in different parts of the world. I then want to give you 3 examples, because I think the answer to the question, will this affect atrocities, is context specific. I don't believe in categorical answers to questions like this. I think it's very much context specific, and so I want to share 3 examples with you and tell you some stories about how those different experiences in those countries inform our thinking about the questions. I then want to give you a set 4 of reasons why it might actually have some potential to stymie atrocity. 4 reasons why we might want to answer the question in the affirmative. Yes, it will have some potential impact on addressing atrocities. And then finish with 4 reasons that we should be concerned that it might exacerbate violence. 4 reasons to think that it may have unintended consequences that make situations worse rather than better. But to fast forward, I guess, to give you the answer to the question before the end, I think the answer is sometimes. Sometimes pillage prosecutions will be able to stymie atrocities. And because the answer is sometimes, it's something that we need to think about very contextually in given situations based on the desires of local communities, but that because it's potentially useful, it's something that we urgently need to think through and invest in. So, the interesting issue in blood diamonds and all the other natural resources is that it's been a problem without a legal remedy. And so we've seen this problem without a legal remedy manifest in a number of different places. People putting up their hands saying, well, what are we going to do about this? Part of what I've been working on, as we'll hear more about in a moment, and others, is the idea that actually blood diamonds, that is, armed groups exploiting diamonds and other natural resources to fund their war effort, involve the illegal exploitation of natural resources. That involves stealing diamonds. And that the political actors and also the companies that are involved in purchasing from these military groups, or together with these military groups, are involved and responsible for those acts of theft in war also. And so this involves really thinking about what has become really an abundant literature now on the influence of natural resources on armed violence. Since the end of the Cold War, illegal exploitation of natural resources has substituted for superpower sponsorship as a predominant means of conflict financing. And there is now a broad sense of this taking place, a broad set of ideas about where and how this takes place, and yet still no concrete application about legal responses to the dynamics we're pointing to. But to sort of quantify the extent of the problem, here is a report from the United Nations Environment Program some years ago that says that over the last 60 years, at least 40% of all intrastate conflicts have a link to natural resources. If you add interstate conflicts, it's likely more. It's possible that we live, and likely that we live in a world where most armed conflicts have some natural resource element involved. And so the potential for what I'm describing is potentially significant. So let me move to the first part where I talk about applying pillage to natural resources. And this is significant because pillage is just a generic war crime. It just means theft during war. And the way that it's usually applied is like this. And this is the traditional expectation. This is a painting. This was a set of events that took place in a town in the Netherlands called Berg op Zoom in the 17th century. It's the Pillage of the city. And this is what people normally think when they think about pillage. They think about soldiers waltzing in, campaigns of violence, rape, murder, and pillage, theft of property. But part of what this work is trying to focus on is that natural resources can be one of the types of property that is pillaged. And this is a picture here of somebody called Walter Funk at Nuremberg. And Funk was the president of a continental oil company that was set up to exploit prodigious quantities of oil throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. And Funk was convicted of pillage, or its synonym, plunder, for these actions. And so you start to get a sense that there is some real potential in this generic war crime to address some of the issues that we're interested in. To make this more germane and more contemporary, there was a judgment on the part of the International Court of Justice, which is a state-to-state court based in the Netherlands, between the Democratic Republic of Congo and Uganda in 2005. And one of the key aspects of that judgment was Uganda is responsible for acts of looting, plundering, the basis is synonym for pillage, and exploitation of DRC's natural resources committed by its troops. And that allows me to explain the project, I guess, in a contemporary way with two inferential steps. The first inference is, well, this is a sort of a state-to-state civil suit between Uganda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. But the underlying legal concept is also a war crime that gives rise to individual criminal responsibility, step one. Step two is that a whole range of actors, not just states, can be responsible for that war crime, including military actors involved in illegally exploiting natural resources, political leaders who are implicated, and also business people. And so there's been some considerable interest in trying to employ this war crime to get at both the means and motivation for armed violence. The means are the ways in which armed groups acquire resources to purchase weapons to carry out massive human rights violations. The motivation is related but distinct, in part to finance armed violence, but also in part to enrich itself. And so the motivation is, well, listen, if we can invade that particular part of Sierra Leone for diamonds, it creates an incentive for violence and atrocity in the first place. So perhaps we can address this aspect and disincentivize atrocity. This is a project that the United States Institute of Peace undertook. And here again you see this idea and its justification that it believes that such efforts will enhance accountability for armed actors and businessmen who have profited with impunity for far too long, and thus decrease their impact in perpetuating violent conflict. The broad goal is to stymie violence. And all of this has led to a change of policy at the International Criminal Court also. And this is a document that was announced in 2016, a policy paper on case selection and prioritization by the prosecutor. And in it, it says that the Office of the Prosecutor will give particular consideration to prosecuting crimes that are committed by means of or that result in the illegal exploitation of natural resources, precisely because of the dynamics that I'm describing. And in undertaking those sorts of prosecutions, pillage is the natural framing, the natural crime with which to process those charges. So I promised 3 illustrations that concretize the abstract idea. And I have 3, the first of which explains a little bit my experience and how I came to be working on these types of issues, and the other 2 more contemporary examples that I've also been engaged with. So the first comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I was saying to some people earlier over lunch, I first became interested in these issues almost 20 years ago when I was working as part of a prosecution team in Rwanda. And it struck me at the time that we weren't really even permitted to see the Rwandan genocide as limited in time or space, because at the time that I was there listening to perpetrators and victims tell their stories, there were massacres of a similar amplitude taking place 100 miles away just across the border in the Congo. And those massacres were a continuation, a terrible continuation of the Rwandan genocide in two respects. The first was, it was literally the violence in Rwanda in 1994 had been displaced across the border and continued in different form. So it wasn't as if things actually ended in 1994, they were just sort of geographically removed. And then secondly, the same sorts of indifference that was offered by Western governments and hand-wringing after the fact, after Rwanda, was again on spectacular show relative to the DRC. And so for my sins, I resolved that I was going to make the Congo a core aspect of what I did professionally. And so several years later, I was working as a prosecutor at the Yugoslav Tribunal in The Hague, but following closely events in the Congo. And I noticed with interest a panel of experts that was established by the United Nations Security Council to investigate the relationship between illegal exploitation of natural resources and continuation of armed violence characterized by spectacular human rights violations. And over the course of 3 years, it produced a set of reports, which I still think are some of the most important work that I've seen done. And that work testifies to a situation where availability of natural resources in war has created win-win situations for all belligerents, such that any aggrieved parties, and there are plenty, can sustain armed violence indefinitely by exploiting natural resources to purchase weapons to continue armed violence. And in the context, it makes reaching peace agreements especially difficult because armed groups have vested interest in the maintenance of insecurity. And this particular diagram proved especially influential. 20 years later, I'm still responding to the diagram. So in this diagram that I've come to call the vicious triangle, they're depicting this relationship between conflict in the left periphery, and this conflict characterized by an estimate 5.3 million excess deaths since 1998, conflict that Madeleine Albright calls Africa's First World War because 11 African countries are fighting in the Congo over the period since 1998, is stimulated by exploitation of natural resources at the apex, arms trafficking, you take the money from the exploitation of blood diamonds or other natural resources to purchase weapons, and you use those weapons to reproduce the conflict, carry out more human rights violations, produce more aggrieved people who, if possible, resort to the same dynamic, thus creating this downward spiral that's exceptionally difficult to escape from. But it struck me then, working as a prosecutor, international criminal justice focuses too much on the conflict element of that triangle. It focuses too much on trying to mop up acts of torture, rape, displacement, and murder once atrocities have run their terrible course. Better to intervene in the other sides of the triangle. Better to try and be proactive and disincentivize other elements of that relationship. And I said to myself also, and weren't there a whole series of cases after the Second World War prosecuting business people and military leaders and politicians for pillaging natural resources? Funk was one of those cases, but I recall there being many more. And weren't some people in the history of international criminal justice held responsible for supplying weapons to notoriously brutal regimes? In the Second World War in particular, it was the provision of asphyxiants, Zyklon B, to concentration camps that meant that the providers of those chemicals were responsible for the crime with which their merchandise was used. And so my thinking was, well, what implications of those cases for the global trade in weaponry, which also involves providing merchandise to notoriously brutal regimes who are very likely to use those in the perpetration of international crimes. Part of me, though, was thinking, this idea of pillage, does anyone talk like that? is that like in the minds of people? And what was interesting to me was the extent to which it really had already infiltrated, had already become part of Congolese vernacular. And so here is a government official journal that creates a particular group of experts focused on the pillage of natural resources in the Congo. There's also a Congolese rap song that I recommend to you, whose refrain is about pillage of natural resources. So it seems to me that in official and in sort of everyday cultural life, this was a regular concept, and I'll return to why it might be in just a moment. There's one manifestation of this dynamic that I want to sort of present to you as a theme that re-emerges in each of the illustrations that I have. And this is a mapping exercise which was undertaken by the United Nations in 2010 and completed. One of its core chapters, so the mapping exercise is an attempt to sort of plot the extent of human rights violations with a view to thinking about where international criminal prosecutions might best achieve some degree of justice in the sea of offending. And one of those chapters is marked natural resources. And in that chapter, there's a relatively fulsome exploration of the dynamics of natural resources and their relationship with human rights violations. I won't say more about that other than to speak to the fact that it rehearses the relationship between natural resources providing means and motivation, that there are important human rights violations involved in the extraction of natural resources. But I do want to give you one particular example which emerges as a recurrent theme. And that is that in a number of places in this report, there's an allegation that the pillage of natural resources is achieved through, one, slavery, and two, with prodigious occurrence of sexual violence. And the sexual violence, I'll come back and weave these recurrent threads together, but the sexual violence is in part, there's evidence that some women are raped in agrarian situations to drive them into artisanal mining, such that armed groups can be more effective in producing natural resources. There's also evidence that it's used to terrorize local populations such that they will remain in mining for armed groups. And there's a potentially deeper logic that I'll discuss as we go through other examples. What I want to suggest to you, though, is that pillage often goes hand in hand with those crimes. All of the cases that involved pillage during the Second World War were also achieved through slave labor in particular, and I'll come in just a moment to explain why and the logic behind that. The next example I have is from Sierra Leone, and this was a case that was involved an individual named Desailly, who was a business person arrested in Belgium 2-3 years ago and charged with pillage of diamonds from Sierra Leone and also slavery, again, the recurrent theme. I want to tell you a little bit about the allegations about Desailly. Unfortunately, he never stood trial. He committed suicide in his prison cell. So, excuse me, I'm just going to deal with that. So, Desailly's case is especially interesting because it undermines a very popular way of thinking about the ways that businesses are implicated in atrocity. And that popular way of thinking about the question is that businesses are generally auxiliary to atrocity. They play a helping hand in supporting, perhaps unwittingly, armed groups who carry out atrocities. They are, in a way, unfortunate victims of circumstance because they became implicated through no strong desire of their own. But what's interesting about, to say the least, or at least the allegations against him, I don't know about their truth, I just know that the allegations are made, is that he's not an accomplice. He's really a driving force in these atrocities. And so the allegations against him were that he personally flew to Liberia to meet with the then president of Liberia, Charles Taylor, cajoling Charles Taylor to invade portions of neighboring Sierra Leone where diamonds were to be found. The allegations are that he personally flew on planes with members of the brutal armed group RUF, taking machinery that would enable the artisanal extraction of mines from this part of Sierra Leone at greater efficiency. And I've read at least one, and that while in Sierra Leone, they co-opted slaves to exploit the diamonds while he was there. And I've read at least one allegation that he personally raped one of the slaves. So this is not corporations being sort of caught up. It's not corporations being playing a helping hand in somebody else's atrocity. This is corporations driving atrocity and corporate interests. And so it really bears emphasizing that there's not really one size fits all to these dynamics, and some of these issues involve direct perpetration rather than complicity. The third example is Myanmar, and this is much more current and new to me, but I have spent the last several weeks reading about this because in a way, this report, which came out just a month or two ago, is the modern manifestation of the UN panel of experts reports that drew me into this line of work 2 decades ago. And what's fascinating about reading this report is the degree of continuity between its content and every other manifestation that I've described to you. So again, the report speaks about armed groups waging war against each other for the control of natural resources, especially jade and gemstones. Again, it speaks about this relationship between pillage of natural resources, forced labor, and sexual violence. They seem to all go together. And in this particular instance, unlike its predecessor, there is a clear call in this documentation for international criminal justice to intervene against businesses involved in these dynamics. So I wanted to share these different examples spread across different conflict zones and across a relatively extended period of time to highlight some of the common themes and to suggest that there's been a shift away from thinking about other forms of mechanism or the absence of any form of accountability to one where international criminal justice is being asked to do this work. So that brings us to Pillage's potential. My promise that I would talk to you about the upsides of using pillage as a means of preventing atrocities. So I wanted to start, I guess, by addressing the underlying logic. Why is it exactly that pillage of natural resources tends to go along with slavery and rape? Those things on their face seem like very different phenomena. Pillage of natural resources is a property crime. Slavery is a very egregious human rights violation of the person. And rape is a form of sexual violence which is exceptionally serious, that's predominantly focused on domination and humiliation. So how do they come together? Well, if you take the first coupling, you see that pillage and slavery go together in the logic of war and atrocity because they are the forced exercise of authority over natural and human resources in war. And rape, while very different in important senses, also has a common theme in that It's the conversion of what is normally lawful practices into something that is criminal through the absence of consent and a powerful form of domination across the three. And so the implications of this are quite significant. By focusing on any one of those, we can disincentivize the others. If you focus on pillage of natural resources, it stands to reason that you may have some effect in limiting both sexual violence and forced labor. But the broader implication isn't just about the human rights that are attendant on the extraction of natural resources process itself. It's the very idea that you can address the motivations for the conflict in the first place. It's not just those specific human rights violations, it's all of the suffering that war entails. By focusing on the other aspects of the vicious triangle, you undermine incentives for violence to soldiers, to their families, to civilians, to bystanders, and so on and so forth. And there's a way of couching that idea that is that uses a different sort of language in international parlance that became very in vogue after the Rwandan genocide. As you recall, after the Rwandan genocide, there really was this international hand-wringing in the West. How could we have let this happen? So many people were killed. We knew about it. Dallaire was sending faxes to the West saying, it's a genocide, every day, without response. And so part of the manifestation of this hand-wringing process, this deep sense of guilt on the part of Western governments, was a push for this idea of the responsibility to protect. We have a responsibility to intervene, to help one another when mass violence and atrocities of this sort take place. That proved controversial for a number of reasons. Quite a few people believe that this is a Trojan horse for military intervention in different conflicts the world over. But a lot of the thinking about responsibility to protect has made the assumption that we're talking about putting boots on the ground. We're talking about all the time sending soldiers. But part of responsibility to protect also envisaged the possibility of criminal prosecutions, short of sending soldiers. And so maybe pillage of natural resources gives us this mechanism for trying to address the dynamics of conflict out of some broader responsibility to respond to the advent of atrocities. Relatedly, maybe pillage of natural resources gives us a backdoor to aggression. Now, if you're not familiar with the term aggression, it's also an international crime. It basically means responsibility for going to war in the first place. Like, who started the war? If you want to use the Second World War as a convenient way of understanding it, both the Nuremberg and the Tokyo tribunals were predominantly concerned about aggression. They weren't concerned about human rights violations as such, principally, nor were they principally concerned about the Holocaust as such. They were concerned principally about who started the war and both Nazi and Japanese responsibility for precipitating this tremendous human disaster. So again, aggression is about responsibility for starting the war. What's strange is, and historians have explained this process, that after the prosecutions in the Second World War, aggression sort of fell away. And in the institutions that I've worked with, it wasn't even included in the statute. It was all about sort of crimes against humanity and human rights suffering and rape and murder and torture. So this photo here is a picture of a conference that took place in Kampala, Uganda in 2010, where states got together in an attempt to define a new concept of aggression that would feature in the statute of the International Criminal Court. The problem with that process is one I can talk to you more about in questions if you want to hear more about it. But the essence of it is there's a big impasse in negotiating how this will work. And it's a big impasse that involves trying to decide what the role of the Security Council is in framing this crime. On the one hand, you have members of the P5 in the Security Council who say, listen, we're not going to give the International Criminal Court any ability to cut across our ability and our power to decide what constitutes aggression. That's the role of the Security Council. Back off. On the other, it's countries like India saying any definition of aggression that defers to the Security Council means that they can never perpetrate it, which is on its face bias, and we're not interested in it. So this negotiation takes place, and what we have is a very circumscribed, limited notion which makes partial deference to the Security Council in ways that people suggest will never be prosecuted because it's so narrowly defined. But Pillage cuts across that dynamic. It bypasses all of those difficulties because it already applies in a general way, and as we saw from the statistics earlier, it probably covers the majority of conflicts because the majority of conflicts have important natural resource implications. So the idea is that by focusing on pillage of natural resources as a backdoor to aggression, you potentially get to generate a deterrence from going to war in the first place if the motivation is to acquire natural resources. So again, that might be plausibly an upside of thinking of pillage of natural resources as a means of stymieing violence and atrocity. The other is decolonization. So in a way, the reason I think that the word pillage was so current in Congolese vernacular is that there's a long history of it. This is a document from 1909 written by an English activist called Edward Morel, talking about the pillage of the Congo Basin. And in a way, the dynamics are a little bit similar. It's someone called Charles Dunlop invents the rubber bicycle tire, which produces a tremendous desire for rubber, and then becomes even more pronounced as the automotive industry takes flight. And this rubber is found in bountiful supply in the Congo, creating just a massive run on Congolese rubber, and the process, the human impact of that process, according to a recent historiography of it, cost 10 million Congolese lives. So, in a way, asserting some degree of control through pillage of natural resource is the exact opposite of that dynamic. It is the exact opposite because it presumes that somebody owns the natural resources in local populations to begin with, which was not the assumption in colonialism. Corporations were always at the vanguard of the colonial project, dragging colonial states with them. And so perhaps there is a possibility of decolonizing this aspect of international law by insisting that someone owns these natural resources and they aren't just the property of whoever can take them. So those, I think, strike me as some of the upsides. I want to talk to you about some of the risks and then give you something of a short response to the risks. So the first counter-argument is, listen, ownership is meaningless in most of these contexts. Ownership is meaningless because there's never been a formal system of ownership of natural resources in this particular part of the world. And we see this in all of the places that I described to you, the Congo, Sierra Leone, Myanmar. You see people saying, listen, the difference between legal and illegal exploitation of natural resources makes no sense because the idea of legal exploitation of natural resources is a practical fiction. None of it has been formal in this sense. This is a picture here of a contract that somebody sent me between a Congolese rebel group and a foreign mining company for coltan. And what's interesting is this Congolese rebel group has a minister of mines. They're allocating particular resources. It looks formal. There's a stamp at the end of it that looks very official. And if you took this document and say, oh, this is official, look at it. But do these people actually own the natural resources? They're a rebel group. And the rebel group is responsible for a tremendous number of human rights violations. But again, the idea is, well, to come in here with formal ideas of ownership makes no sense. It's never been formal. The next idea is dictatorship. And the concern that focusing on formal property rights in conflict zones may entrench dictatorship. The argument goes something like this. Listen, the government in power came to power on the back of pillage of natural resources too, you know. And they don't have stronger democratic credentials than the rebel forces that they oppose. Their human rights record is no better either. But because through military fortune they've been able to seize the capital city, they have some claim to international recognition from other governments, which gives them the ability to control state ownership of natural resources. But by deferring to that process and saying, well, if you control state resources, they're yours, you're backing dictatorial regimes. You're not only backing dictatorial regimes, you're precluding armed rebellion against those regimes. And in that sense, you may be making violence worse. There is also, in contrast to my colonial argument a moment ago, a neo-colonial critique, which is what you're proposing is again the projection of legal ideas into foreign countries that will have radical effects in transforming local populations. And that's especially true, say the critiques, because there is no formal reality in ownership of natural resources in these places, and especially because local populations are dependent on illegal exploitation of natural resources for survival in economies where there is no real alternative. And so the idea of exacerbating violence is also one of the themes. In a situation where all of the exploitation of natural resources is informal, by insisting on formality, you effectively operate like sanctions. You preclude the local population from legally exploiting natural resources, which creates a perverse incentive for a return to violence because there's no other viable means of supporting themselves. So all of these are important considerations and require really careful consideration in concrete cases, especially the idea that these cases may involve exacerbating violence rather than improving it. But I want to suggest to you 3 different reasons why we should be generally skeptical about these arguments. Those reasons are general, specific, and conceptual. So at the general level, it strikes me as a very difficult argument to make over the long term that a continuation of resource wars that is characterized by so many egregious human rights violations is in the net best interests of the local population. I'm not sure what time frame one would make that argument over. It seems to me that without a robust concept of title in natural resources and some meaningful way of insisting on violations of that concept, then resource-rich countries will always be hyper-weak and vulnerable to armed intervention. But whatever the case, it's certainly not for companies to be making the judgment. That's a question for local populations and their representatives, not a question for companies to be making the sort of assessment about whether it's in the net best interests and whether they can just adopt an informal process that's inconsistent with the law based on some projection of how society might function otherwise. The specific example, again, draws on the illustrations that I had. So the argument that it's in the local population's best interests to continue an illegal exploitation of natural resources is inconsistent with all of the evidence that says that the local population is frequently enslaved to exploit it. There's no basis to say this is in the net best interests of the people surrounding a mine zone who are forcibly enslaved and terrorized in order to continue exploiting the natural resource. And then in terms of conceptual ideas, this idea that we should just stop thinking about the difference between legal and illegal natural resources effectively evacuates the notion of ownership of natural resources out of the question. It takes it out and says, that's not really relevant. But that treats natural resources as res nullius, which is a Latin phrase that means the property of no one. If it's the property of no one, you can just go take it. Anyone can go take it, provided you have enough military force behind you. Well, that's firstly the very problem that we're in. That's not a viable situation. But more historically, that very Latin phrase was the basis for colonialism. That was the very basis for colonialism. So, again, adopting that type of thinking structurally replicates the colonial process. In terms of entrenching dictatorial regimes, it depends a little bit on how you conceive of ownership of natural resources. But at its heart, this is a rule of law project. And a rule of law project is one that avoids the arbitrary use of power over everyday life of local populations. It's not a panacea for all aspects of democracy or failings in democracy. It's not a solution that addresses all aspects of life. It's a limited tool, but I think one that can be quite useful. Here is the final conclusion. The last time I was in the Congo, I met with a particular prosecutor who is widely renowned and enjoys an excellent reputation. And I said, listen, one of the problems with this project is it's very top-down, meaning there are people externally thinking that this is an important issue, but it needs a mandate from the Congolese and it needs a mandate from people in Myanmar and elsewhere. And he said to me, listen, James, this is not your project. As far as I can see, this has always been the core problem in the Congo. And then I shared it with some people from civil society later on. And one guy said to me, aghast, I don't think you'll find anyone in civil society who's against these prosecutions. I can get you 120 signatures tomorrow if you want. I said, oh, no, I don't. That's not something I need to do. But nonetheless, 50 NGOs asked the International Criminal Court to start investigating economic and environmental crimes in the DRC, which, if you understand the relationship between the Congolese and the ICC, is significant because mostly Congolese are asking the ICC to back off rather than to be more involved. So I hope this has given you something of a flavor of the issue, the potential, some of the dangers, and also the idea that the answer really to the question is sometimes. But given the potential and the spectacular injustice involved in some of this violence, I think it behooves us to think carefully about ways in which pillage can address these problems if local populations see it as a solution. Thank you so much.